Look, I'm not supposed to be talking about this. If Cardinal Borghese finds out I'm writing any of this down, they'll transfer me to some monastery in Sardinia, where I'll spend the rest of my life cataloging prayer books. But after what happened last month, I can't sleep anyway, so what's the difference? My name is Marco Sabinian, and I've been guarding the Vatican's Forbidden Wing for 2 years now. That's not the official name. Officially it's called Archival Storage Level B3, or some bureaucratic nonsense like that. But everyone who works down there calls it the Forbidden Wing, though most of us have never actually talked about why. I should probably explain how I ended up with this job. 3 years ago, I was Swiss Guard. You know, the guys in the colorful uniforms who stand around looking ceremonial. Except the job isn't as easy as tourists think. Try standing perfectly still for 6 hours while some German family takes 47 photos of you, and your knee starts acting up because you tore your meniscus playing football when you were 16. Then try doing it while some cardinal is screaming at you because you let someone walk too close to the papal apartments with a selfie stick. Anyway, I got reassigned after what they called an incident of inappropriate conduct. What actually happened was I told Cardinal Fierro exactly what I thought about him, making me work a double shift on my birthday so he could attend some wine tasting with donors from Milano. In Italian. Very colorful Italian that my nonna definitely didn't teach me. So they moved me to internal security specialist, which sounds impressive until you realize it means guarding a basement hallway that most people don't even know exists. The pay is the same, thank God, because I send half of it to my mother in Napoli. Papa died when I was in seminary. Yeah, I tried the priest thing for about 6 months before I realized I was terrible at Latin and even worse at celibacy, and Mama's pension barely covers her medications. The Forbidden Wing is 3 levels below the main Vatican museums, accessible only through a service elevator that requires 2 different key cards and a punch code that changes every month. Getting down there is like trying to get into Fort Knox, except Fort Knox probably has better cell phone reception. My phone dies the moment that elevator starts moving, which is just perfect because I like to call Mama before my shift starts. But by the time I remember I need to call her, I'm already underground and it's too late. My first day, they gave me what they called orientation. Sister Mariangela from the archives handed me a folder with about 30 forms to fill out. Insurance waivers, confidentiality agreements, emergency contact information, dietary restrictions for some reason, and told me to report to Father Castellano for briefing. Father Castellano turned out to be this ancient priest who looked like he'd been down in those tunnels since the Renaissance. His Italian was perfect, but he had this habit of switching to Latin in the middle of sentences, and not the simple Latin they teach in seminary. Medieval Latin. Sometimes he'd throw in some Greek, just to keep things interesting. "Marco, figlio mio," he said, gesturing for me to sit down in this office that smelled like old books and something else I couldn't identify. Incense maybe, but wrong somehow. This position requires discretion. You understand discretion, yes? I nodded, though honestly I was more focused on trying to figure out why his office had no windows, but somehow felt like there was a draft coming from somewhere. Bene. Now there are certain protocols you must follow. Non sono regole ufficiali, you understand? More like suggestions. Strong suggestions. He pulled out this notebook, not some official Vatican manual, but a regular composition book like school kids use, with handwriting in at least 3 different languages scattered across the pages. Your predecessor, Giuseppe Fontana, he wrote some things down. Before his transfer. Father Castellano's voice got quieter when he said transfer, like it was some kind of euphemism. I flipped through the notebook. Most of it was in Giuseppe's handwriting. I recognized it from the duty roster he used to fill out. But some pages were in different handwriting, and a few were just blank. Not empty. Blank. Like someone had erased everything very carefully. Giuseppe, he worked night shift like you will. Very dedicated man. Very careful about following the suggestions. Father Castellano took the notebook back and flipped to a page near the middle. Here. He wrote this after his first month. The note was in Giuseppe's writing, but shaky like he'd been drinking too much espresso. Don't let it hear you pray. Marco, if you're reading this, important. When you're down there, no Hail Marys, no Our Fathers, nothing. Silent prayers only, and even then, try not to think too hard about specific saints. It knows the difference. What knows the difference? I asked. Father Castellano just smiled and turned the page. Giuseppe also wrote this. Count your steps when you enter the main corridor. Always count your steps. If the number is different when you leave, Wait 5 minutes and count again. Keep counting until it matches. Don't ask me why, just do it. I stared at the page. Father, what kind of security job requires counting steps? The kind that keeps everyone safe, Figlio. He flipped to another page. Here's another important one. See? Wine in the corner cabinet must stay blessed. Check it every shift. If it looks wrong, cloudy or different color, whatever, call Father Castellano immediately. Do not taste it to check. Giuseppe learned this the hard way. The hard way? Giuseppe spent 3 days in the infirmary with what the doctors called severe food poisoning. Very strange food poisoning that made him speak backwards for 2 hours. Father Castellano closed the notebook, but he recovered completely, grazie a Dio. Most of him, anyway. I wanted to ask what he meant by most of him, but something about Father Castellano's expression told me I wouldn't like the answer. There are other suggestions in here, he continued, patting the notebook. You'll learn them as you go. Giuseppe said it's better to discover them naturally, as situations arise. More organic that way. Can I keep the notebook? Oh no. Vatican policy. All official documentation stays in official hands. But don't worry, you'll remember what you need to remember. That was my orientation. 15 minutes of cryptic warnings and a notebook I couldn't keep. They gave me more training on how to use the coffee machine in the break room than they did on whatever I was supposed to be guarding. The actual wing isn't that impressive, honestly. It's just a long corridor with fluorescent lights that hum too loudly and 6 doors along the walls, 3 on each side. 5 of the doors are normal storage rooms full of boxes and filing cabinets and furniture that looks like it was rejected by the papal apartments. The 6th door is different. It's at the end of the corridor, made of some kind of dark wood that doesn't match anything else down there. Heavy wood, with metal reinforcements and 3 separate locks. No window, no nameplate, nothing to indicate what's inside. Just this door that somehow feels more solid than the walls around it. The first thing I noticed was the salt. There's a line of salt around that door. Not just a little decorative line, but a thick barrier maybe 2 inches wide that goes all the way around the frame and extends about 3 feet out into the corridor. When I asked Sister Mariangela about it during my first week, she just said it was for humidity control and changed the subject so fast I got whiplash. My second week, I was doing my rounds, which basically means walking up and down the corridor every hour and checking that all the doors are still locked, when I noticed footprints in the salt. Not leading to the door, leading away from it. Bare feet, like someone had been walking around down there without shoes. I called Father Castellano's office, but the secretary said he was unavailable for consultation and took a message. He called back 3 hours later. Marco, about the footprints, did you disturb them? No, Father. Should I clean them up? No, leave them exactly as they are. I'll be down tomorrow to refresh the barrier. In the meantime, don't step on the salt, don't touch the salt, and if you see any movement around that area, call me immediately. What kind of movement? You'll know it when you see it. Trust me. That night, around 2 a.m., I was sitting in the guard station reading yesterday's Gazzetta dello Sport when I heard something. Not a loud noise, more like whispers. Conversation. Like 2 people having a quiet discussion somewhere down the corridor. I got up and walked toward the sound, keeping to the middle of the hallway like Father Castellano had told me. The whispers seemed to be coming from near the wooden door, but when I got closer, they stopped. Just like that. Complete silence. That's when I noticed the mirrors. There are 4 mirrors mounted on the walls around the wooden door, but they're not facing out into the corridor like you'd expect. They're angled inward, toward the door itself. At first I thought they were some kind of security system, so guards could see around corners or something. But looking at them from where I was standing, they didn't reflect the corridor at all. They reflected each other. 4 mirrors reflecting 4 mirrors reflecting 4 mirrors, creating this infinite tunnel of images that seemed to go deeper than the walls should allow. And somewhere in that tunnel of reflections, I could swear I saw movement. I stepped closer, trying to get a better look, and my foot hit the salt line. The moment my shoe touched the salt, every single fluorescent light in the corridor went out. I stood there in complete darkness, listening to my heartbeat and trying to remember if there were any windows down there. There weren't. The only light came from the exit sign above the elevator, maybe 40 feet away, casting this sick green glow that made everything look like we were underwater. That's when I heard the footsteps. Not from the corridor behind me, from inside the wooden door. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone pacing back and forth in a small room. Step, 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 turn. Step, 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 turn. regular as a metronome. I pulled out my phone, dead of course, and tried to remember the emergency procedures. Call Father Castellano. But the phone in the guard station was connected to the same electrical system as the lights, which meant it was dead too. The elevator required electronic key cards, which meant I was stuck down there until the power came back on. The footsteps stopped. I stood there in the green-tinted darkness, listening to nothing, and realized I was holding my breath. Then I realized something else. I was counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'd been counting my heartbeats without thinking about it. That's when I remembered Giuseppe's note about counting steps. I started backing away from the door, counting each step. 1, 2, 3. When I reached 27, the lights came back on. Everything looked normal. The salt line was intact. My shoe had barely disturbed it. The mirrors were still angled inward, reflecting their eternal tunnel of images. The wooden door was still locked, still silent. But when I looked down at my feet, I was standing in the exact same spot where I'd seen those bare footprints earlier. I spent the rest of my shift in the guard station, drinking espresso and trying to convince myself that power outages were normal in buildings this old. The Vatican electrical system was installed sometime around the Eisenhower administration, so of course it had problems. And the footsteps were probably just the building settling, or pipes cooling down, or any of a dozen rational explanations. The next morning, Father Castellano came down with a bag of salt, not regular table salt, but coarse gray stuff that looked like it came from some specialty religious supplier. He swept up the old salt line and laid down a new one, muttering prayers in Latin under his breath. "Father," I said, "about last night. See, the power outage. These old buildings, you know. Very temperamental electrical systems." He didn't look up from his work. "But you handled it well." Giuseppe, his first power outage, he panicked. Started praying the rosary out loud. We had to bring in a specialist from Roma to sort things out. What kind of specialist? The expensive kind. Father Castellano finished the salt line and stood up, brushing dust off his cassock. "Marco, let me ask you something. When the lights went out, did you hear anything unusual?" I thought about lying. I thought about telling him everything was quiet and normal. But something about his expression told me he already knew the answer. "Footsteps," I said, "from inside the room." "Bene. That's normal. And you didn't respond, correct? No prayers, no calling out?" "No, Father." I remembered Giuseppe's note. "Excellent." He smiled, but it was the kind of smile adults give children when they're trying not to scare them. "The footsteps, they're not dangerous by themselves. Think of them like a clock. Regular, predictable. It's when they stop that you need to worry." "Stop?" "If the footsteps ever stop completely, and you hear silence for more than 30 seconds, you need to leave the corridor immediately. Take the elevator up to level B1 and wait there until I arrive. Don't go back down alone. Understand?" I nodded, though I understood absolutely nothing. "Good. Now, there's one more thing Giuseppe wanted me to tell his replacement." Father Castellano pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He left this note after his last shift. Said it was important. The note was in Giuseppe's handwriting, but neater than the previous entries, like he'd taken his time. "Marco, the wine in the corner cabinet, it needs to be blessed every month on the feast day of Saint Expeditus. Not Saint Giuseppe, not Saint Marco, Expeditus specifically. I got confused about this and used the wrong saint for 3 months. Bad things happened. Don't make my mistake. Also, the mirrors aren't for security. They're for keeping something in, not for keeping people out. Don't ask me how I know this. Just trust me." "Gee. Saint Expeditus?" I said. "I've never heard of him. Armenian martyr, 3rd century. Patron saint of urgent causes and people who procrastinate." Father Castellano folded the note and put it back in his pocket. "His feast day is April 19th. Giuseppe was very specific about the date." "Father, what exactly am I guarding down here?" Father Castellano was quiet for a long moment, staring at the wooden door with its fresh salt line and inward-facing mirrors. "Officially, archival materials that require climate-controlled storage. And unofficially? Unofficially, Figlio, you're making sure that archival materials stay archived." He left me with that cryptic non-answer and a corridor that somehow felt different now that I knew someone had made mistakes down here before. Someone who'd gotten confused about saint days and learned things about mirrors the hard way. That afternoon, I went to the Vatican library and looked up Saint Expeditus. The librarian, this elderly German nun who looked like she'd been there since the Reformation, Had to dig through 3 different reference books before she found anything useful. "Ah yes, Expeditus," she said in accented English. "Very obscure saint. Popular in New Orleans, of all places. They say he helps with urgent situations, when you need quick results." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "May I ask why you're interested?" "Just curious about Armenian martyrs," I lied. She raised an eyebrow. "Well, if you're planning to pray to Saint Expeditus, be careful what you ask for. The stories say he's very efficient at granting requests, but he doesn't always grant them the way you expect." I spent another hour reading about Saint Expeditus, but most of the sources contradicted each other. Some said he was a Roman soldier who converted to Christianity. Others said he was a bishop who fought against paganism. One book claimed he wasn't a real person at all, just a shipping term that got confused with a saint's name through some clerical error in the 1800s. The only thing all the sources agreed on was his feast day, April 19th. I checked my calendar. It was March 15th. I had about 5 weeks to figure out what blessing the wine actually meant, and why getting it wrong had caused bad things to happen to Giuseppe. That night, I started my shift by examining the corner cabinet Giuseppe had mentioned. It was one of those old wooden pieces that looked like it had been in the Vatican since medieval times, probably some cardinal's personal furniture that got moved down to storage when he died. Inside was a single bottle of wine, red, with a handwritten label in Italian. Vino Sacro, blessed by His Holiness Pope Pius XI, Anno Domini 1936. Blessed by Pope Pius XI nearly 90 years ago. Either this was some kind of incredibly valuable religious artifact, or it was the most elaborate practical joke in Vatican history. The wine looked normal, deep red color, no sediment, cork intact. But when I held the bottle up to the fluorescent light, I noticed something strange. The wine seemed to move on its own, like there were currents flowing inside the bottle, even though I was holding it perfectly still. I put the bottle back quickly and closed the cabinet. My second week on the job, I realized the night shift down in the Forbidden Wing was affecting my sleep schedule in ways that didn't make sense. I'd get home at 8 a.m., exhausted, fall asleep immediately, and then wake up at 2 p.m. feeling like I'd been awake for days. My mother called to complain that I sounded tired every time she talked to me. "Marco mio caro, are you eating enough? You sound like you're getting sick." "I'm fine, Mama. Just adjusting to the night schedule." "Night schedule is no good for you. Your papa, he worked nights at the docks, and look what happened to him." Papa had died of a heart attack, which probably had more to do with 40 years of cigarettes and fried food than his work schedule, but I didn't argue with Mama. You don't argue with Neapolitan mothers about health advice. It's like arguing with the Pope about theology. You might be right, but you're not going to win. The problem wasn't just the schedule, though. It was the dreams. Every time I slept, I dreamed about walking down that corridor, counting my steps. In the dreams, I could never get the count right. I'd walk toward the wooden door counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and then suddenly I'd be at 15 or 23, or some other number that didn't match the distance I'd actually walked. And in the dreams, every time the count was wrong, I'd hear those footsteps from inside the door getting faster and faster, until they sounded like someone running in circles. I'd wake up with my heart pounding and the taste of salt in my mouth. After 2 weeks of this, I was exhausted enough that I made a mistake that could have gotten me fired, or worse. It was about 3 a.m., and I was doing my hourly rounds, walking down the corridor toward the wooden door while mentally complaining about the fact that Vatican health insurance didn't cover sleeping pills. I got to the door, turned around, and started walking back toward the guard station. That's when I realized I hadn't counted my steps. I stopped dead in the middle of the corridor, trying to remember Giuseppe's note. Count your steps entering. Always count your steps. If the number is different when you leave, wait 5 minutes and count again. But I hadn't counted entering, so I had no baseline to compare against when I walked back. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, trying to decide what to do. Go back and count properly? Pretend it never happened and hope for the best? Call Father Castellano at 3 a.m. and explain that I'd forgotten to count steps like some kind of amateur? That's when I heard the footsteps from inside the door stop. Complete silence. I started counting in my head. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. At 15 Mississippi, I heard something else. Knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks from inside the wooden door. I ran. Not walked quickly, not departed with dignified haste. I ran down that corridor like my life depended on it, slammed the elevator call button about 12 times, and spent the next 5 minutes on level B, One trying to convince myself that I hadn't just abandoned my post because of some random building noise. But I knew it wasn't random building noise. Random building noise doesn't knock back. Father Castellano arrived 20 minutes later, looking like he'd dressed in a hurry. His cassock was inside out, and he was wearing sneakers instead of his usual formal shoes. "Marco, what exactly did you hear?" I told him about forgetting to count steps, about the footsteps stopping, about the knocking. 3 knocks. "Yes, Father. Slow and deliberate." "Bene. That's not too bad. 3 knocks means it's just curious. If you'd heard 5 knocks, we would have had a serious problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind that requires calling the Bishop of Roma at 3 a.m., which is a conversation nobody wants to have." Father Castellano straightened his cassock. "Come, let's go back down. I'll reset the protocols." "Reset the protocols?" When someone forgets to follow the procedures, the situation becomes unstable. But it can be corrected if we act quickly. We took the elevator back down to level B3. Father Castellano had brought his bag of salt and what looked like a thermos bottle. "Stay behind me," he said as we approached the wooden door. "Don't speak, don't pray, and whatever you do, don't count anything. Numbers are important down here, and right now the numbers are wrong." He walked to the door and poured salt from his bag, but not in the usual line around the frame. Instead, he made some kind of pattern, circles within circles, with lines connecting them like a geometric diagram I didn't recognize. Then he opened the thermos and poured what looked like wine onto the salt pattern. Not regular wine. This stuff was so dark it was almost black, and it hissed when it hit the salt like acid. "Expeditus, Patronus causarum urgentium," he said in Latin. "Numerus restaurator, ordo servitor." The temperature in the corridor dropped about 10 degrees in as many seconds. "Father," I whispered, "what are you?" "Silenzio," he snapped, then continued his Latin prayers. "Custos vigilat, custos numerat, custos servat." From inside the door came one single loud knock. Father Castellano smiled. "Bene. The count is reset. Marco, walk from here to the guard station. Count every step. Remember the number." I walked back down the corridor, counting carefully. 43 steps from the wooden door to the guard station. 43, I reported. "Perfect. Now walk back, counting again. The numbers should match." I walked back to where Father Castellano was standing. 43 steps exactly. "Excellent. The protocols are stable again." He gathered up the salt and wine mixture with a small brush and dustpan, like he was cleaning up after a science experiment. "Marco, this kind of mistake happens to everyone at least once. Giuseppe forgot to count steps 3 times in his first month. But you handled the situation correctly. You left the area when things became unstable, and you called for assistance immediately." "Father, what would have happened if I'd heard 5 knocks?" Father Castellano was quiet for a moment, cleaning salt residue off the floor. "Let's just say that Giuseppe heard 5 knocks once, and that's why he knows so much about the mirrors." He left me with that ominous non-explanation and a corridor that felt normal again, whatever normal meant in a place where you had to count your steps and reset reality with salt and wine. The rest of my shift passed without incident, but I spent the time thinking about Giuseppe's notes and Father Castellano's cryptic warnings. There were still rules I didn't know, procedures I hadn't learned, and apparently mistakes that were worse than forgetting to count steps. As I was getting ready to leave at 8 a.m., I found another note tucked under my logbook. Different handwriting this time, not Giuseppe's and not Father Castellano's. "Marco, the mirrors are more important than they told you. When you're doing your rounds, look at them carefully, but don't look into them, just at them. There's a difference. If you ever see something moving in the reflection that isn't you or the corridor, don't investigate. Just leave and call Father Castellano. The thing behind the door, it can see out through the mirrors sometimes, but only sometimes. A friend." I looked back down the corridor at the 4 mirrors angled toward the wooden door, reflecting each other in an infinite tunnel of images. Somewhere in that tunnel of reflections, I could swear something looked back. But maybe it was just the fluorescent lights playing tricks. These old Vatican buildings, you know. Very temperamental lighting systems. After 3 weeks of mysterious notes and cryptic warnings, I decided I needed to understand what I was actually guarding. The problem was that researching anything in the Vatican requires approximately 17 different forms, 3 supervisory signatures, and a letter from your parish priest confirming that you're not a communist spy. I started with Sister Mariangela in the archives, figuring she'd processed whatever paperwork created my job in the first place. But when I asked about the history of level B3, she got this look on her face like I'd asked her to explain the third secret of Fatima. Marco, why do you need to know about storage areas? Your job is to guard, not to research. I'm just curious about the building's history, sister. For my own understanding. She stared at me for about 10 seconds, then pulled out a form that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated trees. Request for Historical Archive Access, Form VAT 247B. Fill this out in triplicate, get Father Castellano's signature, bring it back with your employment verification letter and a copy of your security clearance documentation. Sister, I just want to know when the basement was built. The basement was built when it was built, Marco. If you need more specific information, follow the proper procedures. I took the form, knowing full well that by the time I got through Vatican bureaucracy, I'd probably be transferred to some other job entirely. So I decided to try a different approach. The Vatican Library is supposed to be one of the most comprehensive research facilities in the world, but getting access to anything useful requires a doctoral degree, 3 reference letters, and apparently the patience of Saint Sebastian. The librarian who helped me, Sister Brunhild, the same German nun who'd looked up Saint Expeditus for me, was sympathetic but not helpful. Records for building construction? Those would be in the administrative archives, not the library. But I can show you some general histories of Vatican architecture, if that would help. She led me to a reading room that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Council of Trent and brought me 3 books, each weighing approximately as much as a small child. The first book was in German, the second was in Latin, and the third was in Italian but used a typeface that made every U look like a V and every S look like F, which meant reading it was like solving a puzzle while getting a headache. After 2 hours of squinting at medieval typography, I'd learned that the Vatican had been expanding underground storage areas since the 16th century, but there was no specific mention of Level B3 or anything called the Forbidden Wing. The closest I got was a brief reference to specialized storage for sensitive materials during the papacy of Pius XI, but the details were marked as restricted access. See administrative archives. I was getting ready to give up when Sister Brunhild came back with another book, a modern one, thank God, with actual readable text. I remembered we had this, she said, a survey of Vatican architecture from the 1980s. The author had access to construction records that are normally restricted. The book was called Hidden Spaces, a structural analysis of Vatican City, and it was exactly what I needed. Chapter 7 was titled Subsurface Storage and Security Areas, and it had detailed floor plans of the underground levels. According to the book, Level B3 had been constructed in 1936 during a major renovation of the Vatican museums. The official purpose was climate-controlled storage for documents and artifacts that were too sensitive for the main archive areas. But there was a footnote that caught my attention. Construction of Level B3 was supervised personally by Cardinal Pacelli, later Pope Pius XII, and required the consultation of specialists from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The specific requirements for this storage area remain classified, but building records indicate unusual architectural features, including reinforced containment areas and specialized ventilation systems. Specialists from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. That used to be called the Holy Office, which used to be called the Roman Inquisition. When the Vatican calls in the Inquisition to help design a storage area, you're not storing furniture. I flipped to the architectural drawings. Level B3 was laid out exactly as I knew it. A main corridor with 6 doors, 5 storage rooms, and 1 reinforced area at the end. But the drawing showed details I'd never noticed. The ventilation system for the reinforced area was completely separate from the rest of the building, and there were what looked like drainage channels built into the floor around the reinforced door. Drainage channels. For what? The book also mentioned that the mirrors in the reinforced area were installed as part of the original construction, not added later. For mirrors angled inward, specifications provided by external consultants specializing in optical containment systems. Optical containment systems. I made a mental note to ask Father Castellano what that meant, assuming he'd give me another cryptic non-answer. I was copying down page numbers when my pen ran out of ink. Sister Brunhild brought me another one, but when I tried to write, nothing came out. She brought me a third pen. Same problem. Strange, she said. These are new pens. Let me try. She took the pen and wrote a few words on a scrap of paper. It worked perfectly, but when I tried to use the same pen, nothing. Marco, what exactly are you researching? I looked down at my notes. The pages where I'd been writing about level B3 were blank. Not erased, blank. Like the ink had never been there. "Sister, can you see what I wrote on this page?" She looked at my notebook. "I don't see any writing, Marco. Just blank paper." I could remember writing down page numbers, quotes from the book, architectural details. But the pages were completely empty. "Let me try something," Sister Brunhild said. She took my notebook and wrote "test" in large letters across a page. Then she handed it back to me. The page was blank. "Interessant," she murmured. "Marco, I think you should speak with Father Castellano about this. Sometimes the Vatican has unusual security measures for certain types of research." I left the library with a notebook full of blank pages and the growing realization that whatever I was guarding didn't want to be researched. That afternoon, I tried a different approach. If the Vatican's own systems were blocking my research, maybe I could find information somewhere else. I went to an internet cafe near the Pantheon, one of those places where tourists check their email and upload photos of the Colosseum. I spent an hour searching for Vatican Level B3, Vatican Forbidden Wing, Vatican Subsurface Storage, and every combination I could think of. Most of the results were conspiracy theory websites claiming that the Vatican was hiding alien artifacts or the bones of Jesus, which wasn't helpful. But I did find one interesting result, a blog post from 2018 by someone claiming to be a former Vatican employee. The post was titled, "Why I Left My Job at the Vatican," and it mentioned Level B3 specifically. They assigned me to overnight security in the basement levels. Everything was normal until they moved me to what they called specialized storage. I won't go into details about what I experienced down there, but I will say this. If you ever get offered a job guarding anything in the Vatican's underground areas, decline politely and find work somewhere else. Some things are better left alone. The post had been up for 3 years and had exactly 0 comments, which seemed suspicious for something that dramatic. I tried to click on the author's profile to see if he'd written anything else, but I got an error message. This account has been suspended for violations of terms of service. I was about to give up when I remembered something Giuseppe had written in his notes. Don't ask me how I know this. Maybe Giuseppe had done his own research. Maybe he'd learned things that weren't in any official records. Giuseppe Fontana had been transferred to rural parish work, according to Father Castellano, but he hadn't said which parish. Vatican personnel records are classified, but transfer announcements are sometimes published in the Vatican newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano. I spent another hour at the internet cafe searching through back issues of L'Osservatore Romano. Finally, in the March 15th edition, exactly 1 week before I'd started my job, I found a small notice in the personnel section. Giuseppe Fontana, formerly of Vatican Security Services, has accepted a position as assistant to the parish priest of San Michele Arcangelo, Roccaraso Abruzzo. Roccaraso was a small mountain town about 2 hours east of Rome. Far enough from the Vatican to ensure that Giuseppe wouldn't be dropping by for casual visits, but close enough that they could keep an eye on him if necessary. I memorized the parish name and address, then deleted my browser history and left the cafe. That night, I started my shift with a new plan. If I couldn't research the Forbidden Wing through official channels, I'd learn about it the way Giuseppe had, through experience. I'd been following the rules for 3 weeks, counting steps, avoiding prayers, checking the wine, staying away from the mirrors. But Giuseppe's notes suggested that he'd learned the most important things by making mistakes. Maybe it was time for me to make some controlled mistakes of my own. I started with something small. During my 1 a.m. rounds, I deliberately miscounted my steps, just by 1. I walked toward the wooden door counting 1, 2, 3, 4, but when I got to 26, I said 27. Nothing happened. I turned around and walked back, counting correctly this time. 26 steps back to the guard station. No power outages, no footsteps, no knocking. Either my mistake wasn't significant enough to matter, or the thing behind the door was getting used to minor rule violations. At 2 a.m., I tried something slightly more aggressive. I did my usual rounds, but when I got to the wooden door, I stopped and looked directly at one of the mirrors. Not into it, like the anonymous note had warned against. Just at it. At the physical mirror itself, the frame, the way it was mounted on the wall. The mirror was older than I'd thought. The frame was carved wood, dark with age, with symbols along the edges that didn't look like any Christian iconography I recognized. More like geometric patterns, or maybe very stylized letters in some language I didn't know. As I was examining the frame, I noticed something else. The mirror wasn't reflecting what it should have been. I was standing directly in front of it, but my reflection was slightly off to the left, like the mirror was showing me where I had been a few seconds ago instead of where I was now. I moved to the right. My reflection stayed where it was for about 3 seconds, then jerked to the new position like a video with bad lag. I backed away from the mirror quickly and continued my rounds. But for the rest of the night, every time I walked past that mirror, I could see my reflection in my peripheral vision, and it was always a few seconds behind where I actually was. At 4 a.m., I made my most significant rule violation yet. I prayed. Not out loud. I wasn't completely stupid. But while I was sitting in the guard station, I found myself thinking about my mother's health, about her doctor's appointment next week, about whether her pension would cover her new medications. And before I could stop myself, I was mentally reciting a Hail Mary. Ave Maria, piena di grazia, il Signore è con te. The moment I finished the prayer, every fluorescent light in the corridor started flickering. Not the steady flicker of failing bulbs, but a pattern. Long flash, short flash, short flash, long flash. Like Morse code. I grabbed a piece of paper and started writing down the pattern. Long, short, short, long, short, long, short, long, 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 short, short, long. After about 2 minutes, the flickering stopped. I looked at what I'd written down and tried to remember my Boy Scout training from 20 years ago. Morse code. Long, short, short, long was Q. Short, long, short was R. Long, long, long was O. QRO dash? I kept decoding. QRO manuus. Cause custodiet ipsos custodes. Who watches the watchman? Is a famous Latin phrase, but this looked like someone had tried to spell Romanus, Roman. Or maybe quid Romanus. What Roman? Or it could have been complete nonsense, and I was seeing patterns where none existed because I'd been working night shifts for 3 weeks and my brain was turning to mush. But I didn't think it was nonsense. Something behind that door had heard my prayer and responded with lights flickering in Morse code. Something that knew Latin. I spent the rest of my shift trying to decide whether to tell Father Castellano about the Morse code message. On one hand, he'd told me to report anything unusual. On the other hand, I'd gotten the message by deliberately breaking one of Giuseppe's rules, which might get me transferred to some monastery in Sardinia. At 7 a.m., I made my decision. I called Father Castellano's office and left a message with his secretary. This is Marco from level B3. I need to speak with Father Castellano about some unusual electrical activity. It's not urgent, but I think he should know. He called back an hour later, just as I was getting ready to leave. Marco, what kind of electrical activity? The lights were flickering in a pattern last night. Like Morse code. I wrote it down. It spelled out something in Latin. There was a long pause. Marco, did you do anything that might have encouraged this electrical activity? I could lie. I could tell him the lights just started flickering on their own. But something about his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I prayed, I said, silently. Just a Hail Mary. Ah, see, that would do it. What was the message? I think it said Quid Romanus. What Roman? Another pause, longer this time. Marco, I think it's time you met with someone who can give you more complete information about your position. Are you free this afternoon? Yes, Father. Bene. Come to my office at 2 p.m. And Marco, bring Giuseppe's notebook. The one I showed you during orientation. But Father, you said I couldn't keep the notebook. I said you couldn't keep it. I didn't say you couldn't borrow it for educational purposes. After I hung up, I realized that Father Castellano had never actually taken Giuseppe's notebook back after my orientation. It had been sitting in my locker for 3 weeks, and I'd never thought to look at it again. Maybe it was time to see what else Giuseppe had written about the rules, and about whatever was behind that wooden door that knew Morse code and asked questions about Romans. Maybe it was time to learn what specialized storage really meant in Vatican terminology. And maybe it was time to find out why my predecessor had been transferred to a mountain village where the nearest internet cafe was probably 50 kilometers away. At 2 p.m., I knocked on Father Castellano's office door with Giuseppe's notebook tucked under my arm and a growing suspicion that my life was about to get considerably more complicated. Entra Marco, came his voice from inside. Father Castellano's office looked exactly like what you'd expect from a priest who'd been at the Vatican for 40 years. Books stacked everywhere, a crucifix that probably predated the Reformation, and the kind of wooden desk that could survive a nuclear war. What I hadn't expected was the other person sitting in the worn leather chair across from his desk. She was maybe 60, with steel gray hair pulled back in a way that suggested she'd given up caring about fashion sometime during the Clinton administration. She wore a simple black business suit and the kind of sensible shoes that said she'd rather be comfortable than impressive. But her eyes were sharp, and when she looked at me, I got the feeling she was cataloging everything from my shoe size to my sleep schedule. "Marco, this is Dr. Elisabetta Conti," Father Castellano said. "She works for, let's call it a specialized department within the Vatican administration." Dr. Conti stood up and shook my hand with the grip of someone who'd spent years dealing with people who didn't want to cooperate. "Marco, I understand you've been asking questions about your work assignment." "Si, dottoressa. I was just trying to understand what you're guarding." "I know." She sat back down and opened a leather portfolio that looked like it had seen better decades. "Father Castellano tells me you've been following the rules Giuseppe left for you, but that you've also been experimenting." I glanced at Father Castellano, who nodded encouragingly. "I wanted to understand what I was dealing with," I said. "The notes Giuseppe left were incomplete. I thought if I could research the history of the area." "And how did that research go?" Dr. Conti asked. "Not well. The library records kept disappearing when I tried to write them down. And when I tried to search online." I shrugged. "Nothing useful." "That's not entirely accurate," she said, flipping through some papers in her portfolio. "You found a blog post from 2018. You looked up Giuseppe's transfer location. You discovered that Level B3 was built in 1936 under Cardinal Pacelli's supervision. You also learned about optical containment systems and specialized ventilation." My stomach dropped. "How do you know all that?" "Marco, when someone starts researching classified Vatican operations, we notice. The blank pages in your notebook weren't an accident. They were a security measure. The blog post you found was bait, designed to see how persistent you'd be. And the internet cafe near the Pantheon has been monitoring Vatican-related searches since 2001. I looked at Father Castellano. "Am I in trouble?" "That depends," Dr. Conti said before he could answer. "Father Castellano tells me that last night you received a response to your prayer. Something in Morse code." "Quid Romanus," I said. "What Roman?" "Actually," she said, consulting her notes, "the complete message was 'cause Romanus custed it." "Who guards the Roman?" "You stopped copying the pattern before it finished." The light stopped flickering. "No, Marco. You stopped paying attention because you were trying to decode what you'd already written." The entity was still transmitting for another 43 seconds. She pulled out a transcript and handed it to me. The complete message read, "'Cause Romanus custed it Romanum? Quid Romani timent? Cur non venient?" My Latin was rusty, but I could work out the basics. "Who guards the Roman? What do the Romans fear? Why don't they come?" "It's asking about Romans," I said. "But we're in the Vatican. We're all technically Romans." "Not all of us," Dr. Conti said. "You're from Naples. Father Castellano is from Palermo. I'm from Milan. Giuseppe was from Bari. But there's one person associated with Level B3 who was actually from Rome." She flipped to another page in her portfolio and showed me a photograph. A man in his 50s, wearing the black cassock of a priest, standing in front of St. Peter's Basilica. Father Alessandro Romano, born in Rome, 1901. Died in Vatican City, 1937. He was the priest who designed the containment protocols for Level B3. "What happened to him?" "That's classified. But I can tell you that his death occurred exactly 1 year after the containment system was put in place, and that his final confession lasted 6 hours and had to be written down because he couldn't stop talking." Father Castellano leaned forward. "Marco, what Dr. Conti is trying to explain is that your job isn't just security. It's communication management." "Communication management?" "The entity behind the wooden door has been trying to communicate with Vatican personnel for 87 years, Dr. Conti said. "Most of the time, it receives no response, which keeps it relatively quiet. But when someone prays in its presence or violates certain protocols, it becomes more active." "More active how?" "Questions, demands, attempts to negotiate." She closed her portfolio. "Marco, I need to ask you something very important, and I need you to be completely honest. Since you started working Level B3, have you experienced any unusual dreams?" I thought about it. "I've been having trouble sleeping, but that's normal for night shift work." "What kind of trouble sleeping?" "I keep waking up at 3:33 a.m. Every night, exactly 3:33. I'll be deeply asleep, then suddenly I'm wide awake, like someone called my name." Dr. Conti and Father Castellano exchanged glances. "Anything else?" she asked. "Sometimes when I wake up, I have the taste of wine in my mouth. But I don't drink alcohol. What kind of wine? Sweet, like communion wine, but older, thicker. Marco, Father Castellano said gently, have you been checking the wine in the cabinet every night like Giuseppe's notes instructed? See, of course. Every night during my 2 a.m. rounds. And it's always been there? The same bottle, in the same position? I started to say yes, then stopped. Actually, now that you mention it, the bottle has been getting emptier. When I started the job 3 weeks ago, it was about 3/4 full. Now it's maybe half full. But you've never seen anyone drink from it? No, never. Dr. Connie made a note. Marco, I'm going to explain something that may be difficult to understand. The entity behind the wooden door is not entirely contained. Small parts of its influence can extend beyond the physical barriers, especially when someone with regular access to the area develops a connection with it. A connection? You've been tasting the wine because you've been drinking the wine. Not physically, the bottle in the cabinet is still there. But during your 3:33 a.m. awakenings, your consciousness has been visiting the containment area. The room started to feel smaller. That's impossible. Is it? Think about your dreams, Marco. Not the waking up part, the part before you wake up. What do you dream about? I tried to remember. The past 3 weeks had been a blur of exhaustion and confusion, but now that she mentioned it, conversations, I said slowly. I dream about having conversations with someone I can't see. Someone with a very formal way of speaking. Like they learned Italian from old books. What do you talk about? They ask me questions about my life. About my family, my work, why I came to the Vatican. And I answer them, because in the dream it seems rude not to. What else do they ask about? Recent history. They want to know about modern Rome, about changes in the church, about why Vatican City is so small now compared to how it used to be. I paused. They seemed confused about a lot of things that happened after 1937. Dr. Connie closed her portfolio with a snap. Marco, you need to understand that these conversations are not dreams. They are actual communications with the entity. And by answering its questions, you've been providing it with information it hasn't had access to in 87 years. What kind of entity is it? That's classified. Dottoressa, with respect, I've been feeding classified information to this thing for 3 weeks. I think I have a right to know what it is. She looked at Father Castellano, who nodded. Its name is Marcus Valerius Corvus, she said. It was a Roman general during the reign of Augustus. It died in 31 AD, but something went wrong with the process. Something went wrong with dying? Something went wrong with staying dead. By the time Christianity reached Rome, Marcus had become something that wasn't quite human anymore. It spent several centuries trying to understand the new religion, and when the church gained political power, it offered its services to various popes. What kind of services? Military advice mostly. Strategic planning. Marcus had been a very capable general, and that knowledge didn't disappear when it changed. Several medieval popes consulted with it during the Crusades. So it's not evil? It's not evil, Father Castellano said. But it's not human either. And over the centuries, its understanding of Christianity became idiosyncratic. By the Renaissance, it was offering theological advice that was causing problems for church doctrine. What kind of problems? It insisted that Christ was a military commander who had been misunderstood by his followers, Dr. Connie said. It wanted to help organize a new crusade to reclaim the Holy Land using modern military tactics. It claimed that prayer was a form of strategic communication that was being wasted on requests for personal favors. That doesn't sound completely unreasonable. It also claimed that the Vatican should return to the governmental structure of the Roman Empire, with the Pope as Augustus and the College of Cardinals as the Senate. It offered to serve as the military commander for this new Holy Roman Republic. In 1936, Pope Pius XI decided that Marcus's advice was becoming more problematic than helpful. But you can't exactly execute something that's already dead, and you can't exile something that doesn't have a physical body. So they built the containment system. And it's been down there ever since? More or less. The containment works by limiting its ability to communicate with the outside world. As long as nobody prays in its presence or engages with it directly, it remains relatively dormant. But I've been engaging with it directly. See, and that's why we need to talk. Dr. Connie stood up and walked to Father Castellano's window, which looked out over St. Peter's Square. Marco, the entity has been asking you questions about modern Rome, modern church politics, current world affairs. Based on our analysis of similar cases, it's trying to update its strategic understanding so it can make new offers of assistance to church leadership. What's wrong with that? The last time it made a formal offer of assistance was in 1936. Its proposal involved reorganizing the Vatican as a military state, reclaiming the Papal States through armed force, and launching a new crusade with the goal of establishing Christian dominance over the entire Mediterranean region. That's insane by modern standards, but Marcus thinks in terms of Roman military strategy from 2,000 years ago. Its understanding of appropriate military action is somewhat different from ours. I sat back in my chair. So what do you want me to do? Nothing different from what you've been doing, Dr. Connie said. Continue following Giuseppe's rules. Continue your regular duties. But we need you to be more careful about the dream communications. How do I do that? When it asks you questions, answer them. But answer them selectively. Don't provide information about current military capabilities, current political tensions, or current religious conflicts. Focus on cultural changes, technological developments, social improvements. You want me to censor my own dreams? We want you to avoid accidentally giving a 2,000-year-old Roman general the information it would need to plan a modern military campaign. Father Castellano leaned forward. Marco, there's something else. Dr. Connie hasn't told you why Giuseppe was really transferred. Giuseppe violated the rules somehow? Giuseppe started agreeing with Marcus, Dr. Connie said. After 6 months of dream conversations, Giuseppe became convinced that the church had lost its way, that we needed to return to a more militant approach to spreading Christianity. He started suggesting that we release Marcus and let it advise current church leadership on strategic reformation. And that's why he was transferred to rural parish work. That's why he was transferred to a parish where the nearest internet connection is 50 kilometers away and the priest is 83 years old and speaks only dialect, Father Castellano said. We needed to make sure Giuseppe couldn't contact anyone who might take his suggestions seriously. Are you going to transfer me too? That depends, Dr. Connie said, on whether you can handle the dream communications without being influenced by them. Marcus is very persuasive. It's had 2,000 years to practice convincing people that its ideas are reasonable. What if I can't handle it? Then you'll be transferred to a rural parish where you can spend the rest of your career organizing church festivals and teaching catechism to children who would rather be playing football. She sat back down and opened her portfolio again. Marco, I need you to understand something important. Your job isn't just about following Giuseppe's rules. It's about maintaining a balance. Marcus needs enough interaction to keep it from becoming agitated, but not enough interaction to make it think it can negotiate for release. So I'm like a therapist for a 2,000-year-old Roman general? More like a diplomatic liaison, and the diplomacy is very delicate. Father Castellano handed me a new notebook, not the cheap one I'd been using, but a leather-bound journal that looked official. From now on, you'll keep detailed records of your dream communications. Write down everything Marcus tells you, every question it asks, every suggestion it makes. Dr. Connie will review your reports monthly. And if Marcus asks me why I'm suddenly being more careful about what I tell it the truth, Dr. Connie said. Tell it that Vatican policy requires more formal documentation of communications with consultants. Marcus understands bureaucracy. It spent most of its career dealing with Roman administrative systems. What if it doesn't believe me? Then you'll find out exactly why Giuseppe's rules exist and why this position comes with hazard pay. She closed her portfolio and stood up. Marco, I want you to know that this assignment is voluntary. If you'd prefer to be transferred to regular security duties, that can be arranged. No questions asked, no negative marks on your employment record. I thought about it. I thought about my mother's medical bills, about the extra pay I was earning for night shift work, about the fact that regular Vatican security guards spend most of their time telling tourists they can't take photographs in the Sistine Chapel. I also thought about the dream conversations, about Marcus's formal, old-fashioned way of speaking, about how it seemed genuinely curious about modern life rather than malicious. I'll stay, I said, but I want to understand the rules better. Giuseppe's notes were incomplete, and I've been making mistakes. What kind of mistakes? The mirror reflections are delayed. The wine level in the cabinet is dropping. And last night, during my 4 a.m. rounds, I heard footsteps in the corridor even though I was alone. Dr. Connie and Father Castellano exchanged another look. Marco, Father Castellano said carefully, what time did you hear the footsteps? Around 4:15. I was doing my final check of the doors, and I heard someone walking behind me. But when I turned around, there was nobody there. And the footsteps stopped when you turned around? See, but I could feel someone watching me for the rest of my shift. Dr. Connie reopened her portfolio and made several notes. Marco, we may need to adjust the containment protocols. The footsteps suggest that Marcus is developing more substantial manifestation capabilities than we realized. Is that bad? It's not good. Physical manifestation is usually the precursor to attempts at direct communication outside of the dream state. What would that mean? It would mean that Marcus wants to talk to you while you're fully conscious and alert, rather than during the vulnerable state of sleep. And that's a problem because conscious communication is much more difficult to control or monitor. And because Marcus would have access to your full range of knowledge and decision-making capabilities, not just the limited information available during dream states. Father Castellano stood up. Marco, I think we need to modify your duties temporarily. For the next week, you'll work with a partner during your shifts. Who? Me, Dr. Connie said. I'll be observing your interactions with Marcus, both during your regular duties and during the dream communications. You're going to watch me sleep? I'm going to monitor you during the sleep communications, yes. We have equipment that can detect when these interactions are occurring, and we can record some of the content. That seems like a privacy violation. Marco, you've been having regular conversations with a non-human entity for 3 weeks. Privacy is less important than making sure those conversations aren't compromising your psychological stability or Vatican security. She handed me a business card with just her name and a phone number. Starting tomorrow night, you'll work your regular shift, but I'll be present in the Level B3 area. I'll set up monitoring equipment, and if Marcus attempts direct communication, I'll be able to intervene. What kind of intervention? The kind that ensures you don't end up like Giuseppe, convinced that the church needs military reorganization under the guidance of a 2,000-year-old Roman ghost. I looked at the business card, then at Father Castellano, then back at Dr. Connie. Dottoressa, can I ask you something? Of course. How many people like Marcus are there in Vatican containment? She smiled for the first time since I'd met her. Marco, that's a question for someone with a much higher security clearance than you're ever going to get. But there are others? Let's just say that the Catholic Church has been around for 2,000 years, and we've accumulated a lot of consultants who didn't want to stay properly dead. And they all need guards. Some need guards. Some need caretakers. Some need conversation partners. Some need to be fed blessed wine on a regular schedule. She shrugged. It's a diverse administrative challenge. How do I know which kind Marcus is? You don't. That's why we're going to be working together for a while. She picked up her portfolio and headed for the door. Marco, tomorrow night, arrive for your shift 30 minutes early. I'll brief you on the monitoring equipment and explain some additional protocols you'll need to follow while I'm observing. Additional protocols? Nothing too complicated. Mostly documentation requirements and safety procedures. She paused at the door. Oh, and Marco, starting tomorrow, you should probably stop drinking so much espresso. Caffeine interferes with the monitoring equipment. After she left, I sat in Father Castellano's office for another 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd learned. Father, am I in over my head with this job? Probably, he said. But Giuseppe lasted 6 months before he started having problems, and you've only been there 3 weeks. And you seem less susceptible to Marcus's suggestions than Giuseppe was. How do you know that? Because Giuseppe started calling Marcus General after 2 weeks and asking it for advice about his personal life. You're still calling it the entity and trying to maintain professional boundaries. Is that good or bad? It's good, Marco. It means you understand that Marcus isn't your friend, it's your assignment. I left Father Castellano's office with more questions than answers, but at least now I understood why Giuseppe's rules existed and why my job came with hazard pay. I also understood why the Vatican needed guards for Level B3, and why those guards occasionally needed to be transferred to remote parishes where their ideas about church reform couldn't influence anyone important. What I didn't understand was whether I was strong enough to spend months or years having dream conversations with a 2,000-year-old Roman general without eventually agreeing that maybe, just maybe, the church could benefit from some strategic military advice. But I was going to find out. 3 months later, I was sitting in the Vatican's employee cafeteria at 6 a.m., drinking my 4th espresso of the night and trying to explain to my replacement why the wine cabinet wasn't actually about wine. So the bottle needs to be blessed every month? Luca Ravenna asked, scribbling notes in a spiral notebook that looked exactly like the one I'd started with. He was maybe 25, fresh from the Swiss Guard, and had that eager look that meant he still thought Vatican security was about protecting important people from terrorists. See, but not by just any priest, I said, stirring sugar into my cup even though I'd already added 3 packets. Has to be Father Castellano or someone from Dr. Connie's department. Regular parish priests don't have the right clearance. And I'm supposed to check it every night during the 2 a.m. rounds? Check it, don't touch it. Just make sure it's there and that the level hasn't changed too much. I paused. Actually, the level will change. About a quarter bottle per month. That's normal. Normal how? I realized I was about to explain something I still didn't fully understand myself, which had become a recurring theme in my life since starting this job. Look, Luca, you're going to have dreams. Probably starting within a week or 2. You'll wake up at 3:33 a.m. and you'll taste wine even though you haven't been drinking. That's part of the job. Dreams about what? Conversations. With someone who talks like he learned Italian from a very old textbook. He'll ask you about your family, your life, current events. Answer his questions, but don't give him information about military stuff, political tensions, or anything that could be used for strategic planning. Luca stared at me. Marco, are you feeling okay? Because this sounds insane? See, I know. But in about 2 weeks, when you start having those dreams, you'll remember this conversation and realize I was trying to help you. I handed him the leather-bound journal Dr. Connie had given me 3 months ago. It was full of detailed notes about my dream conversations with Marcus, observations about changes in the containment area, and incident reports that read like the world's most boring supernatural thriller. Write down everything, I said. Every dream, every question Marcus asks, every answer you give. Dr. Connie reviews these monthly, and if you start agreeing with Marcus's suggestions about church reform, you'll be transferred to a parish in Sicily where the biggest excitement is the annual feast day procession. Who's Marcus? The entity behind the wooden door. He's a Roman general from 2,000 years ago who's been giving the Vatican military advice since the Middle Ages. Very knowledgeable, very persuasive, very convinced that the church needs to return to a more militant approach to spreading Christianity. Luca closed his notebook and leaned back in his cafeteria chair. Marco, I think maybe you should talk to someone about these dreams you've been having. I've been talking to someone, Dr. Connie, who's been monitoring my dream communications with Marcus for 3 months. She's the one who recommended I be transferred to day shift work. Why? Because after 3 months of regular dream conversations, I started thinking some of Marcus's ideas about Vatican organization weren't completely unreasonable. That wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. The real reason for my transfer was more complicated and had to do with an incident 2 weeks ago that I was specifically instructed not to discuss with my replacement until he'd been on the job for at least a month. What had happened was this. During one of my dream conversations, Marcus had asked me about modern Vatican City's relationship with Italy, specifically about whether the Pope still had temporal authority over any territory outside of Vatican walls. I'd explained that Vatican City was now just 121 acres and that the Pope's political influence was mostly diplomatic rather than governmental. Marcus had found this deeply troubling. In his opinion, the Church couldn't effectively spread Christianity without controlling significant territory and military resources. He'd spent several dream sessions outlining strategies for how the Vatican could reclaim the Papal States through a combination of financial pressure, political maneuvering, and selective military intervention. His plans were detailed, well-reasoned, and completely insane by modern standards. They were also sophisticated enough that Dr. Connie worried Marcus was developing strategic capabilities that could be dangerous if he ever found a way to communicate his ideas to someone with actual political influence. The incident that triggered my transfer occurred when I woke up from one of these dream conversations and realized I'd been taking notes. Not just mental notes, but actual written notes in a small notebook I kept on my nightstand. Notes that included detailed tactical assessments of various European military capabilities and suggestions for how the Vatican could exploit current political tensions to expand its territorial influence. I'd been writing in my sleep, in handwriting that looked like mine, but was somehow more formal, more organized. And I had no memory of writing any of it. Dr. Connie called it automatic transcription, and explained that it meant Marcus was developing the ability to influence my behavior even when I was unconscious. She recommended my immediate transfer to duties that didn't involve regular exposure to entities with temporal influence capabilities. But I couldn't explain any of this to Luca because new guards needed to develop their own relationship with Marcus before they were informed about the more problematic aspects of the containment system. Luca, just follow Giuseppe's rules, write down your dreams, and don't be surprised if you start having opinions about church politics that you didn't have before. If that happens, talk to Father Castellano immediately. What kind of opinions? The kind that involve reorganizing Vatican City as a military state and launching new crusades to reclaim the Holy Land. Luca stared at me for a long moment. Marco, I think you need a vacation. I'm getting one. Starting Monday, I'll be working day shift security for the Apostolic Palace. No more night shifts, no more level B3, no more dream conversations with 2,000-year-old Roman generals. And you're happy about this transfer? I thought about it. The honest answer was complicated. On one hand, I was relieved to be away from Marcus. 3 months of regular dream conversations had left me exhausted, confused, and occasionally convinced that maybe the Catholic Church really had lost its strategic edge over the centuries. I was tired of waking up at 3:33 a.m., tired of tasting wine I hadn't drunk, tired of spending my days trying to figure out whether my own thoughts were actually mine, or whether they'd been influenced by a non-human entity with strong opinions about military organization. On the other hand, I was going to miss the conversations. Marcus was intelligent, curious about modern life, and had fascinating perspectives on historical events he'd lived through. Talking with him was like having access to a living library of ancient Roman culture and military strategy. And despite Dr. Conni's warnings about his influence capabilities, I'd never felt like he was trying to manipulate me, just trying to understand the modern world through conversation with someone who had regular access to current information. I'm happy to be getting normal sleep schedules again, I said finally. And I'm happy that I won't have to worry about accidentally providing classified information to someone who thinks the solution to modern problems is territorial expansion through military force. But Marcus isn't evil, Luca. He's just very, very old, and his understanding of appropriate solutions to problems is based on strategies that worked 2,000 years ago. Be respectful when you talk to him, but don't let him convince you that his ideas about church reform would work in the 21st century. I finished my espresso and stood up. I need to get home and sleep. Real sleep, without dream conversations. My replacement orientation shift ended an hour ago, and my mother is expecting me to call her this afternoon. How is your mother doing? Better. The surgery went well, and the medical bills are manageable now that I've been getting hazard pay for 3 months. I picked up my jacket. Luca, one more thing. The footsteps you'll hear during your 4 a.m. rounds aren't your imagination. Marcus is developing stronger manifestation capabilities, which means he's starting to have a more substantial presence in the physical world. What should I do about footsteps? Nothing. Just acknowledge them and continue your rounds. If you try to investigate or if you acknowledge them directly, Marcus might interpret that as an invitation for more direct communication. More direct than dream conversations? Marcus wants to have conscious conversations while you're fully awake and alert. Dr. Conni considers this problematic because conscious communication would give him access to your full range of knowledge and decision-making capabilities. And that's bad because the last guard who had conscious conversations with Marcus started suggesting that the Vatican should recruit him as a military advisor for current church leadership. Luca reopened his notebook and wrote something down. What happened to that guard? Giuseppe? He was transferred to a rural parish where he now organizes church festivals and teaches catechism to children. His suggestions about church reform are no longer a security concern because the nearest internet connection is 50 kilometers away and the parish priest is 83 years old and speaks only dialect. That doesn't sound so bad. Giuseppe had a degree in international relations and was planning to apply for diplomatic positions within Vatican foreign affairs. Now he spends his time planning harvest blessing ceremonies and mediating disputes about whose turn it is to clean the church restroom. See. So when Marcus starts suggesting that his strategic advice could be useful for modern church leadership, remember Giuseppe and keep your opinions about church reform to yourself. I left Luca in the cafeteria with his notebook and his questions and walked through Vatican City toward the employee exit, thinking about my 3 months of level B3 duty. The job had been exactly what Dr. Connie warned me it would be, a diplomatic liaison position with a non-human entity who understood bureaucracy, military strategy, and persuasion much better than I did. Marcus had been polite, curious, and genuinely interested in learning about modern life. He'd also been subtle in his suggestions about how current church leadership could benefit from strategic advice based on 2,000 years of experience. But I was leaving level B3 with more questions than answers. I still didn't know what Marcus actually was, whether he was the ghost of a Roman general, some kind of temporal entity that had taken on the personality of a historical figure, or something else entirely. I didn't know why the containment system worked or what would happen if it failed. I didn't know how many other entities like Marcus were contained in other areas of Vatican City, or what kind of advice they were providing to church leadership. What I did know was that the Catholic Church had been around for 2,000 years and had accumulated a lot of consultants who hadn't wanted to stay properly dead. I knew that some of these consultants needed guards, some needed caretakers, and some needed regular conversation partners to keep them from becoming agitated. I knew that the Vatican's approach to managing supernatural consultants was basically the same as their approach to managing any other bureaucratic challenge. Assign someone to handle it, document everything, and transfer personnel who developed problematic attitudes. I also knew that my replacement was going to discover all of this gradually, the same way I had, through incomplete information, contradictory instructions, and dream conversations that would slowly convince him that maybe, just maybe, Marcus's ideas about church organization weren't entirely unreasonable. But that was no longer my responsibility. Starting Monday, I'd be working day shift security for the Apostolic Palace, where the biggest supernatural threat was tourists trying to take unauthorized photographs, and the most complex communication challenge was explaining Vatican dress codes in multiple languages. I was looking forward to boring work, regular sleep schedules, and dreams that were actually dreams rather than diplomatic meetings with ancient Roman military strategists. Though I had to admit, I was going to miss the conversations.